Great. Well, first, thank you everyone for coming out this afternoon. This is a really wonderful turnout, and we're really looking forward to sharing our thoughts with you and having a conversation at the end. So you know, my name is Mcdermott. I'm the Collection Development Manager at ArtStore, and I wanted to, again, thank you for joining us for our panel, Solving a Pain in the Asset, New Approaches to Digital Asset Management. It's the rim shot session of the day. So as we'll hear from our speakers today, some museums, many museums, have had digital asset management systems in place for years, and others are just starting to tackle this really complicated issue. We'll also learn that there are as many ways to approach, think about, or avoid digital asset management as there are museums. And also, rather than focusing on kind of technical nitty-gritty, today will be a little bit more about museum culture, institutional culture, policies, and so forth. So just for very briefly, one of the reasons as someone who works at ArtStore we wanted to organize this panel is because we're also dealing with these issues. So internally, as we continue to launch and ingest collections in the ArtStore Digital Library, and as we develop Shared Shelf, our media management software, which is currently used by colleges and universities, and we're hoping to test it out with some museums, which Evan will talk about today. And also, externally, as our partners in the museum community are thinking about these issues, it impacts how we all collaborate together. So it's really about kind of a big network and how we're dealing with these really complex issues. And so I'm just going to introduce all of the speakers at once instead of jumping up in between all of them. And we're going to hold all the questions until the end. So with that, first we'll hear from Scott Sayer, who in collaboration with ArtStore has recently conducted a series of interviews with museums in the US, as well as a large-scale international survey to assess how museums are currently managing or not managing their digital assets. Scott is the founder and principal at Sandbox Studios, a Minneapolis-based group that works with museums to plan, create, manage, and assess education programs and technology projects. He has a doctorate in education and has over 25 years of experience working with emerging education and information technologies. Scott currently teaches at Johns Hopkins University, serves on the MCN board, and is the past chair of the New Media Consortium and the AAM Media and Technology SPC boards. A lot of acronyms there, Scott. It's very impressive. He previously held positions of Director of Media and Technology at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and Media Applications Researcher at the University of Minnesota's Telecommunications Development Center. Next, Evan Toll, who's the librarian for reader services at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, will talk about the PMA's recent work in digital asset management, which is being led by the library through their use of Shared Shelf. As a result, the library is bringing a distinctly end-user approach in managing exhibition installation photography and other non-object-related materials. As I just mentioned, Evan is the librarian for reader services at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He received his MLIS from Simmons College in 2001 with a concentration in archives management. And prior to being at the PMA, Evan served as assistant archivist and photo curator at the Urban Archives at Temple University. And last will be Sham Oberoi from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who will talk about how the Met is now managing multimedia in their digital asset management system, which encompasses EPUBs, audio guides, video, a lot of interesting materials. Sham is the general manager for collections information services at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and oversees a team with operational responsibility for the storage and dissemination of all images and other multimedia content related to the museum's 2 million works of art. Before joining the Met, Sham worked for a number of nonprofit, corporate, and governmental organizations, including the New York Bar Association, VA Hospital, MCI, Lehman Brothers, and Accenture. He has a BA in computer science from Manhattan College and an MA in English from New York University. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Scott Sayer.
All right, you've seen my entire presentation in reverse now. I'm glad you're all here. There's so many great sessions going on right now, and this one's going to be a great one because we have very different presentations. So I had the wonderful opportunity to do some research having to do with digital asset management. It's something that I've been interested in my long and varied career in museums, and it seems like it's really starting to get some legs now. So when ArtStore approached me and asked me if I wanted to help them do some digging in this area, I was really pleased. So I wanted I have a lot of information, and we're making it all public, and I'll give you a URL at the end where you can get access to all the findings. How many of you took part in either one of the interviews or the survey? Oh, excellent. Hey, we got at least a dozen people. That's great. So I'm just going to jump in and tell you, I've got 12 findings that I want to point out, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. I have yet to really dig in and do a lot of correlations, which you'll see that, you'll see more of that later. So first of all, the goals of this project really were to better understand the internal and external landscape of digital asset management today in museums, and also look at aggregation projects, because this is something that participating in these large-scale aggregation projects like Google Art Project, DPLA, and those types of projects, one of the things that a lot of museums are interested in, and we wanted to see, what ArtStore might be able to do to help people be able to participate in more of those projects, as well as just what the challenges and interest was in there. And then the last thing is to really just help ArtStore understand how they can better serve the community through tools and services. So our methodology was, we did 8 different interviews with 8 very different types of institutions, Cooper Hewitt being a part of the Smithsonian, so connected to a very large organization. The Dallas Museum of Art with Rob Stein doing really progressive work down there in a fairly large budget. The International Center of Photography, which is got holdings that have real tight copyright restrictions on them, and it's really kind of their bread and butter to a certain degree, is controlling those assets. The Minnesota, instead of it all just being art museums, we put some other types of museums in there, in the Minnesota Historical Society, which is a very large historical society with a myriad of different types of collections. And then there's the Minnesota Digital Library, which is a state digital library that's made up of 165 different small historical organizations, many of them just being historic buildings in small towns in Minnesota that are trying to digitize their assets and get them all together into a digital library like DPLA. And the Peabody Essex, which is a complex museum. The Terra Foundation, which used to be a museum and now just loans its collections out all over the world of American art. And then the Walker Art Center, who has very, they're a multidisciplinary art center, so they're working on actually capturing performance and managing performance as a digital asset. And so there's real range of stuff. At the same time, we did an online survey. Actually, we did it after the interviews because we derived a lot of the questions from the survey from the interviews. And I want to give you a breakdown because this is really important going in before we look at some of the data and what I'm going to tell you. It's really important to kind of understand who the people who answered these questions are. So first off, you can see I don't know how easy it is to read this. It was hard to find the right chart color. But the Fine Art Museums made up almost 50% of the respondents, followed by the historical museums. And science museums and university museums were kind of the smallest respondents. The majority of the people who participated in the surveys were from fairly large museums with 100 staff members or more. And I think this is a really important piece of information to keep in mind. And it's interesting too because it says a little bit about our who's interested in digital asset management and is interested enough to come forward and fill out a survey. So you can see that collections and registration make up the majority of the respondents. That these are people who self-identified and working in these areas. They made up the majority of the respondents to this survey. So obviously, the data is going to reflect their views. Interestingly enough, I advertised this survey on Museum L. I may advertise this survey on MCN's listserv. I did it through LinkedIn, as well as we sent personal invitations to a ton of people. And we were certainly not targeting these specific people, but for some reason, the collections people and the registrars are the ones that filled out the survey, primarily. So, the first really interesting thing, and I think for me this is very exciting, is that there's finally some real traction in the area of digital asset management. We found that 28% of the people responded that they currently have a formal digital asset management system. 17% are actually working on a solution, in other words, discussing it. 15% are actually implementing one right now. So we've got 60% of the people who are actively going to either in the process of setting one up, purchasing one, or already have one. And then we've got another close to 25% of the people discussing what they're going to acquire. Some people have working alternatives, but the majority of people majority of respondents are moving forward in this area. Again, this could be influenced by who's filling out this, but the departments. One of the survey's questions was, what departments will benefit the most from digital asset management? And the top 5 were collections, imaging, visual resources, which can be, I've debated this with a number of people. In some museums, it's what used to be the slide librarian. And in other places, imaging is a part of that. Curatorial and exhibits. But you can see that there's a really strong focus on that part of the museum, which is really only capturing a certain kind of digital asset. And the top 3 media types, and photography was far the number 1, was photography, media, and text. Again, if you really want to get in the details, go look at the data. I didn't want to overwhelm you with the real data. The part that I think we should really concern ourselves with, and again, part of this is a reflection on who filled out the survey, but I also think there's a reality here too, is there's these other departments that I think if you really did a close analysis of what these departments do with digital media, they really should be thinking about digital asset management, and we shouldn't leave them behind. And particularly when it comes to, well, these are kind of the bottom of the barrel on the list, and the fact that we aren't actively thinking about how we manage our graphics that we generate and our design documents and all these other things that we actually put just as much energy as we do into our digital photography, in many cases more. And I know this to be the case not just from the survey, but from talking to people in the interviews. When it comes down to these, how are you managing your building layouts and your InDesign documents and a lot of those types of assets, that stuff is really still under the radar when it comes to digital asset management. And I think it should be something that we all think a lot about. So what people found to be some of the most important features of digital asset management and reasons to justify buying a system is, number 1 by far was a controlled multi-level way of accessing the collection. Number 2 was being able to generate assets as needed and manage those assets so that you actually could maintain one master file and keep control and keep a tune of how your derivative assets were being made. And number 3, somewhat surprising, is using it as a means for public access to the collection. A lot of people I talked to, as well as folks that filled out the survey, are looking at the digital asset management system as being potentially a roadway to put their collection out there online. I didn't touch on this in this presentation, but most museums, there's a lot of questions that I'm not going to cover, but one of the questions was, how are you currently putting your collection online? And almost everyone just has a hybrid solution that they've built in-house. There's very little consistency on how people are putting their collection dynamically online, and I think a lot of people see digital asset management as a potential way of doing that. The greatest perceived benefits of doing it is centralized storage, preservation. This is a term that a number of people, I got a lot of people writing me when I sent out the survey, which was great because it showed people were very interested, but a lot of people said, do people really know what preservation means? Because there's so many definitions. And so I think there is definitely room for a lot of interpretation there. But I think what it means is making sure that we have the master asset in one place. I think long-term strategic preservation is probably not something that everybody was thinking of when they were filling this out. Reducing redundancy, controlling access once again, and managing rights. And rights comes up quite a bit, as you'll see. One of the things that came out that I think is very interesting and is a little bit of a warning to everybody is there are a lot of the museums that were early adopters of digital asset management systems adopted large enterprise systems because that's what there was initially, were these things that were really made for the advertising industry and other large industries. And many of the museums that adopted those are abandoning them. Because they were so complex that the learning curve and the complexity of just managing those systems far outweighed the benefit, or it was a detriment to actually it being easy to use and being widely adopted. And so, and unfortunately, a lot of those systems were, $500,000 or more. But I think the good news is that museums really will benefit more from smaller systems that are more agile and easier to use, and that they aren't the magic bullet, are these really expensive systems. In fact, simple is better. The people that have successful solutions tend to be the ones that have very simple requirements for entering information in, and there's very limited barrier to putting information in. It's a very easy process. There's not a lot of metadata required. And they have some very specific places where it can be of immediate benefit rather than trying. The other thing that I heard in my interviews is people that tried to roll it out across the institution. That was, epic fail. That actually trying to get some real targeted applications of digital asset management and then expand upon that is a much better way to take advantage of kind of the learning curve internally as to how to best use it. Another kind of frightening fact is I asked what people were doing to manage their digital assets if they didn't have a digital asset management system, and even if they did, and everybody's putting stuff in Dropbox, and everybody's putting stuff on Google Drive, and everybody's using YouSendIt, and they're all saying, and we don't know where, everybody who has a computer's got a different Dropbox and a different YouSendIt account, and all that stuff's out there, and we have no idea where it is. And I think, this is a nightmare, really, to a certain degree, because there's a lot of stuff out there that probably is never going to be properly archived. And so, this is a call for thinking about, where the heavy-duty users of these types of tools are probably some of the low-hanging fruit for early adopters of a digital asset management system. Other good news is I found that a lot of museums are hiring specialized staff to just focus on digital asset management, which I think is, or it's a part of their role, which is great, because I think it's one of the real difficult things is it's kind of like the website in that it affects everybody. To say that one particular department owns digital asset management is tough, because it's not really a siloed kind of thing. It's an institutional tool set. And so I think actually having some specialists in these areas that aren't just serving one particular department or another, but are looking for overall institutional strategies is great, and we're seeing some of that. So I want to move on and talk a little bit about what we found out about interest in digital asset aggregation. I thought this was incredibly interesting. As a person who worked on Amico way back when, and with ArtStore on a number of projects, and felt the resistance there was to museums actually putting their assets out there, there's been such an amazing change in so many ways in this regard. And what I found is, by far and away, museums were very interested in participating in these aggregation projects, which I was very surprised. I thought there was a lot of interest, but I did not think it was going to be half as high as what I ended up finding out. The main reason why museums are interested in participating in these projects is that they feel that it actually fulfills their online access goals, which was how most of these projects tried to justify it in the first place. But I think there was so much internal resistance about dilution of brand and things like that that there was a pushback. The other thing that helps people decide if they want to participate in these is, what's the intended audience for the particular project? Is it for K-12? Is it just universal? And then how easy is it to participate? What's the barrier to entry? One thing that fell really low, which I thought was interesting, was who the sponsor of the project is. If it's Google Art or it's ArtStore or it's PLA, it didn't really seem to matter to people. It really was kind of mission-driven as to if people wanted to participate. Some of the greatest obstacles to participating were time and capacity, which is not surprising because the barrier to participating in a lot of these things requires some dedicated time and energy. Copyright issues was a close number 2 as to people feeling that, and I think in many cases what copyright means for people is not so much that they can't, but they don't know if they can. You know, they don't really have the boundaries to just push a button and say, export everything that I feel comfortable is in the public domain or that is copyright cleared. And then tied for number 3 were 4 things, amazingly, because there was a long list. But metadata requirements and ease of exporting data, dilution of brand did come up, which I was hoping that would go away. And then locating images, which many of these things, if you think about digital asset management and you look at this list, you could say, well, that would solve a lot of those. You know, a lot of these are because people don't have digital asset management systems yet, or they're not fully implemented. Another really interesting finding, and it kind of goes back to you know, some of, I think, significant seed change, and is related to the previous session today on open content, is that there's definitely growing definition of fair use and a lot less resistance to putting things out there. So 38% of the museums are willing to put thumbnails regardless of if they're in copyright or they're copyright protected or not, which is a huge change from what it used to be. And 19% say everything that's in the public domain, our museum's policy is that we can put high-res downloadable images. Only 4% are putting high-res downloadable images of everything regardless of copyright, and I do know a few of those. But it's, I think the landscape is really changing in that regard. One interesting thing that didn't really fit in either of these, but I found in my conversations with people, is that bandwidth is still an issue for a lot of museums. A lot of museums still have really restricted bandwidth when it comes from inside their museum to the outside world and back. And so a lot of these cloud-based solutions that people are talking about, which I'm a big fan and supporter of, depending on where your institution's located and what kind of connectivity you're able to have, and a lot of times that's not even within your own control. It happens to be the exterior infrastructure of the neighborhood or city where you live in. There still are numerous issues when it comes down to this. So my conclusions are that digital asset management is finally getting some real traction, that it's a thing that people are really working on. But the implementation strategies are still really tricky. I think that there's so few good examples of full institutional implementation at this point in time that we need to see more and more of those. And the other thing that I think is a really important point is that we just need to focus more on this peripheral data and it just not be about the collection images and the stuff that comes out of our imaging departments, but all the other digital assets that our organizations are managing. And these guys are gonna touch on some of that as well. So the full results of the survey are at this URL. And if you would like to send me comments, you can either write me directly or if you write me, I can give you access to this and you can actually write comments in the Google Doc because I'm very interested in correlations you want to see. Just a couple things that are in there that I didn't cover. There's a really significant, there's a survey of what digital asset management systems people are currently using. There's a list of digital asset management systems people are considering using. There's a list of what collections management systems people are currently using. There's a list of what tools people are using to put digital images up on their website. And there's a list of all the different career areas having to do with digital media and everything from CTOs to digital librarians that gives a breakdown of what different museums have as a way of staffing. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there that's really too hard for me to encapsulate here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. And thanks to Scott for addressing the situation of peripheral assets, because what I'll be talking about primarily is peripheral assets. Let's just see if we can close you out. So I'm Evan Toll. I'm the librarian for Reader Services at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And for the past few months to a year, depending on how you count, we've been involved in an exploration of the tool Shared Shelf, which is a product or a service of the Art Store service, to see if it can give us any help with non-object photography. And the reason why we focus on non-object photography is that object photography is actually relatively simple within the organization for us. We run a TMS implementation. TMS has a media module attached to it. If we ever need to know what the file name of a given piece of media related to an object of art is, well, we can just look that up and find it. Things get much, much more complicated as soon as we're talking about things other than works of art, images of events, images of exhibitions, images of people. And those things are in really very high demand for products of the museum, for annual reports, for social media, for all of those things. And those, you may wonder why a librarian is talking to you about that. Those are the questions that come to me. So I have this very urgent need to give my users access to these assets that they need access to in order to do their jobs to work for the museum. The other point, and Scott brushed upon it, was the role of the slide librarian. And at the Philadelphia Museum of Art Library and Archives, we've been, over the years, sort of collapsing roles and looking more and more about whether it's really meaningful to separate the access to material based on what it is. And the decision we made a number of years ago was, well, it's not a meaningful distinction to make text access different from image access. So we in fact collapsed the role of the slide librarian, the slide librarian, and the image librarian, and the digital assets librarian into reader services. So the reader services unit, in fact, services circulation and reference, and we do all of this digital asset stuff. And if anyone needs information, they know they can call the library, we'll answer the phone, we will give them what they need as far as we can. Certainly there are assets that we can't provide access to because of rights restrictions. So given that, how many of you use ArtStore or are familiar with ArtStore as a user? Only a couple. So oh no, more. Think about it. So I'm just gonna, you understand that ArtStore is a giant database full of images gathered from libraries and archives and some slide collections and some independent artists and some other people that Ian can talk about if he wants to right now. And one of the things that we've been employing it for over the years, and these are all screenshots, I'm afraid, just because it's more efficient that way. We've been employing it for a few years to deliver groups of images to groups of users who need to have access to them. Specifically in our case, we have a core of 250 or so docent guides who volunteer at the museum. And because they're volunteers, they don't have access to the traditional things that museum employees have access to. They don't have access to TMS. They don't have access to our, we call it Marcel, it's the kiosk version of TMS essentially. And that's the kind of thing that staff have access to. But every time there's an exhibition and every time these groups of people train on new things or have a continuing education program on new things, they need access to a bundle of images related to that. And they also need access to it in a very controlled kind of way. So often we password protect groups because the exhibition isn't public enough yet or the checklist isn't developed enough yet. So we've been doing this for years, and we've been doing it with a tool called Personal Collections, which you may not have known existed. But as part of your ArtStore agreement, every single user who's registered and has instructor level privileges has 1 gigabyte of storage space into which they can load assets particular to them or particular to their class. And it's an academic tool. It's designed for professors. And with nothing else to use at our disposal, we had been using that for years and years just to deliver these sets of images to the sets of users, to the group of users that need to have access to them. So we were pretty excited to hear about Shared Shelf, because what Shared Shelf does is work as an institutional personal collection. It allows the institution to load images in, to share them within the community, and then to do some other things if we choose to. But mostly what we're looking at right now is sharing them within our community and then some other stuff. So I'm going to show you first what it looks like to be a volunteer for our museum and access this stuff. And I'll also say that from the outset, from when I started, which was 2005, 2006, somewhere around there, what the library has supported has been ArtStore. We've supported the ArtStore OIV, and we've taught that to all of the volunteers as their presentation tool. They're very familiar with these tools, and they have no problem going in, accessing a password-protected folder. They have no problem logging in from home, getting access to these results. So to capitalize on that, we were even further excited to hear about Shared Shelf. But for a while, it didn't really have a museum idea of itself. So we've been exploring what it looks like if you throw a museum at Shared Shelf and what happens then. So normally if you're logging in from home, the system recognizes you as a PMA person. And we organize current study sets so that they're browsable. These don't necessarily need to be searchable because these are only for specific groups of people right now. So there you can see our current group of continuing education study sets. There's American Mavericks, there's China study sets, Japan study sets, and one that I've intentionally hidden from you, so you can't really make it out. But you can see that some of them have 42 things, one has 37, one has 23, one has 33 in it. As we open it up, we see that within it, ArtStore materials like this jar, do I get a pointer? Yeah, this jar on the left, which is something that we donated formally to the ArtStore collection, is commingling with all these little things that have H's next to them, and all of that is hosted material. That's stuff that we've loaded in through Shared Shelf so that it operates seamlessly along with the existing ArtStore materials or existing personal collections materials. And all of these work fine in the OIV, which is the offline image viewer. In case you're not familiar with it, if you're not, you should really try it out. It's pretty cool. So these are all working just fine. As we open up one of the records, this is the one that we added via Shared Shelf. We can see the usual tombstone metadata, plus a few things that you wouldn't normally add. Measurements are important because any given guide kind of needs to know the size of something. Because remember, often they're preparing before they see the thing. So this is just some continuing education stuff of our own collection, but if this was an object that was on loan to us that was very seldom seen publicly, they would have no idea what the size was, and they really need to be prepared for that as they walk into a gallery for the first or second or third times with a group of people and they're conducting a tour of it. So you can see that we've got all of this data right here. We've got it by dynasty correctly. And this data is coming from our TMS implementation. It's only as big as we've given it. So we haven't given it the 60 megabyte files. We've given it what we call our TMS size 4 file. So it's 1536 pixels at the longer dimension. But it's sufficient for study. It's sufficient to show what they need to see before they see the original thing. They're really just a visual mnemonic. And what was surprising to me, what was incredibly surprising to me, was that all on their own, the guides discovered the ArtStore mobile app. And then they came to me and said, hey, can you show me how to put this on my iPad, just like I saw Millie do. And I had never heard of it before because personally I didn't own an iPad. So then we bought a couple iPads and we looked into it. And sure enough, it actually works really well. And as we explored it further, it works astonishingly well. So this is what that same group of Chinese study images looks like on an iPad. The resolution's spectacular. And here's one of the types, this is another object that I didn't show you before. This is a horse, he's Chinese. And this is how he displays on the iPad. And again, guides can tote around their iPads actually more easily than they can their laptops. And so they're studying from these image groups that they can get access to through their iPads. And if we could scroll down right now, I would show you that there's descriptive metadata is below this. And the mobile app has a few different interfaces that you can play with. This just happens to be one of them. There's also a zoom, there's a flashcard function. So what we've done is we've decided that the library is going to support one platform for guides to be teaching with in the galleries, and that's going to be the ArtStore mobile app. So as they need things like contextual images to add depth to their tour on self-taught artists, if they want to show portraits of them, if they want to show a map of where they live, they're all going to get that from a vetted group of images that the library can control. So we'll accept a group of suggestions from them. It has to be in the form of, I need a picture of a loom for tapestries or something like that. Or I need a picture of the kind of kiln that was used to manufacture this kind of thing. We'll make sure that they have a legitimate image that's appropriate for that, to answer that question. And then we'll load it in as yet another group that they can access through their iPads, so that as they're giving a tour in the gallery, they can show these licensed images, whether they be from ArtStore or from another vendor that we might use, like ImageQuest from Britannica, which is very good for showing things like flax or raw silkworms, things like that, which ArtStore may or may not have. So that was great, and then we offered it as well to our education department and said, well, we're doing this for the guides anyway. Do you guys want to hop on board as well? And they said, well, sure, because they've had the same problem, finding an application that'll work on iPads that they can bring into the galleries and know that they're all using the same set of images, and it's not difficult to transfer them from one iPad to the other because everyone can get access to this stuff too. So as an aside, we were surprised about the success of the ArtStore mobile app. And again, it works with all of that stuff that we've loaded in through Shared Shelf and we've loaded in through Personal Collections and is already in the library. If we put exhibition study sets up, they look kind of like this. They're based on the space, again, to prepare the guides for what they're probably going to encounter in that space. This can change and does change 20 times during the development of an exhibition, and that's okay. We update it as soon as we get a new checklist from the curator. And in this case, the checklist wasn't done until a week before the thing opened, but that was fine. We can still do it. It's not a problem, and everyone's results are affected immediately. We don't have to send around an email saying, hey, look at the revised checklist, or here's a revised checklist, and here are the images. It's just part of their experience. We could give them a heads up, I suppose, but generally they encounter it, they know it's going to change, and that's that. So here's what it looks like in the rotunda of our current Surrealist show, which is a collection exhibition. We're going to focus on that little lamp on the end there. And so this was an object that was added late to the exhibition, along with 14 other objects. So this gave us a chance to experiment and finally try to figure out, okay, so the other data we had entered in from TMS manually. Now let's see if we can export it out of TMS directly into Shared Shelf, and it turns out, yes, we can. This is what Shared Shelf looks like on the back end. And you can see that you can export records and you can import records, and how that works is through an Excel file. So you load in a whole bunch of assets, you export the Excel file, and then you have it as an Excel file. In the meantime, you have an object package in TMS. You export that as a very structured Excel file. You mash the two together, you import them back, and it populates the records with all of that data from TMS. It took us about a day to figure this out, and so far it's working beautifully. You can take a look here at some of the data as it was brought in from TMS, and we were delighted to see that the image view could be brought along as well. So for that lamp that we were talking about before, we can see here that what we have, the view we have is the front of the lamp. And so that's important for three-dimensional objects, of course, the front, bottom, recto, verso. And there it appears on the record. And we didn't have to physically do anything to these. So that was project one. That's actually object data because it's easier to conceptualize and it's easier to move. And we knew we had this very urgent need to get these materials to these users, and that was great. So the next project we needed to explore was exhibition installation photography. And we've been doing this for years in a digital assets module of our library catalog. So here you see our library catalog, which, if you care, is Alepht's Ex Libris product. And there's an exhibition called Best Dressed. So if we execute a search on Best Dressed, we get not only the exhibition images, you see there is the first result, but we also get the catalog, and then we get the label copy, which is something we always keep in the library for record-keeping purposes. We can see all the versions of everything. If we open up that first record, we see a MARC record. And I've highlighted a few things that to a librarian are very important. A MARC record is traditionally very good at telling us what something is. It is 15 slides. The slides are of an exhibition, and that's the end of that subject heading there. And the exhibition is about costume design or fashion designers or costume designers and so forth. And as we move into different data forms, that's something that the library cares about deeply, is being able to kind of capture those relationships because we know what we need. We need images of an installation, and it gets tricky. Keywords don't do it. We need to be able to use some kind of structured interface. So This is our little diagram of the isness, the ofness, and the aboutness as expressed in a MARC record. And this is AACR2 MARC, not RDA MARC, which is the new descriptive format. A logged-in user can open it up and gets a JPEG of the installation. And we can search on all of the installation photography that we have loaded in there. It looks like this. You notice that you can only see one at a time. No. As we look in ArtStore, here's the same exhibition, Sense of Style. Excuse me, Best Dressed is this one. Now we have a graphical interface, and we have a much longer record. And something we've discovered is we may need to nix this big, long description that we've added from the MARC record, because this isn't the place that we want people to go for information about the exhibition. It's where they go to discover images of the exhibition. So this is why it's faster. We can bulk upload, just like you bulk upload into anything else. And this is the shared shelf backend here. It's a traditional browse window. You upload the files. You can group them so that you can manage them better and manage their metadata better, as you see on the left. And this is something that we're playing out too. This is project number 3. And what this is event photography. So this is a dance performance that occurred in relationship to our Merce Cunningham and John Cage show, Dancing Around the Bride, and Duchamp, earlier this year. And you can see that it has a specific date, and that's not something that ArtStore yet can facilitate, is the searching on an exact date. And that's something that's ultimately important for us if we're going to use this for exhibition installation photography. But how we're exploring this is with our photography department, and specifically for non-object photography. And we're trying to work out a workflow using shared shelf and using some of the features of the back end that makes their job very easy as they enter data. You know, let's just do 4 fields. Tell us what the date was, what the event was, you know, what related exhibition it has. That's it. Maybe then at that point we take it on in the library and flush it out and flesh it out and make it a more complete record. So you can see those all populating here. They look beautiful. They work beautifully. One other important point to make, and will you give me another warning as needed, Ian, please. One of our own staff asked, well, if we're contributing all of this data to Google Images and to all of these other big projects out on the web, why would we want to contribute them to ArtStore? And the reason why is that there's a lot to be said about having a consistent haystack. We need to know what's in the haystack. So here are the results that are the response to a question from a costume designer. I need to design a costume from a certain period of years in a certain country. And I don't want pictures of fancy people, you know, that doesn't help me. I need it to be a peasant or a common person. Well, at that point, what they really need to do is look at a whole bunch of pictures of genre prints or genre paintings so that they can see depictions of people about that time, because the secondary sources aren't helping us there. But we have a vast data set of known images. We know what the body of this data is comprised of, so we can ask sophisticated questions of it that yield results like this so that a costume designer can do this. We know that we can find high-resolution images for our conservators as they're working on like paintings. This is a Damascena, and we were restoring one in the PMA, and the conservators needed to see the details in that corner there. How were the brushstrokes made? What was actually done in that painting? We didn't know from ours, but we can find out from somebody else's. So there we know we can go to and get a very high-definition file and study it in great detail. Or in this case, we had our own little miniature portrait of a gentleman, 17-something or other. And we needed to know whether the little piece of jewelry on his cravat or his stock or whatever it was he was wearing was idiosyncratic to him or was a common kind of thing. And again, what we do is we turn to ArtStore and we say, well, show us all the portraits from this period to this period, and let's look at the neckwear. And we can zoom in on the neckwear, and we can look and see if this piece of jewelry is something common or if it's something that's unique to this, or it appears unique to this sitter. In this case, it appeared unique to this sitter because we went through thousands and thousands of portraits of men from about this period. And that's a search that's not meaningful to do within our own collection. It's only meaningful to do to a giant data set of art. And so that's why we need ArtStore to be there, to give us these consistent results in the same way that we need WorldCat to tell us if a book was published. We don't necessarily need access to the book. We just need to know whether it exists. We don't really need to touch this this painting, but we need to know that that representation exists so that we can answer our question. We've also found that we can add electronic reserves through Shared Shelf because it can take PDFs. So that was one problem. Another problem that we solved using the Shared Shelf app is loading in PDF documents of articles. They work just fine. We can load in lectures as well. If someone's missed a lecture, we can load it in that way. It saves our own bandwidth. If someone is accessing it from home, our own bandwidth isn't implicated in that. It's straight from ArtStore to the user. And the user, again, is restricted to our own population, but our own population working at home. And this is what it would look like. We can throw a whole bunch of uncatalogued archival images at it, knowing that we have a meaningful file naming system. That MDP right there means Marcel Duchamp papers. And so even if we haven't fully cataloged these, or even if a collection isn't processed, we can at least get it into the back end where we can find it. And the question's gonna come to me, oh, you know that picture of Otto is in front of a tapestry, there's some armor. Yeah, here it is. And then I'll leave you with this problem. This is a painting, this is Guernica, as installed in the 1950s in our museum. It's actually an installation photograph, but it's the kind of thing that we're hiccuping on a little bit as we discuss whether we can add all of our exhibition installation views to the DPLA. Is this kind of problem? Well, it's a very good depiction of Guernica. Guernica's not in the public domain. We're not entirely sure who owns the rights to it. It might be the Picasso estate, it might not. What is it about? What is it depicting? What is it of? How do we describe it? And that's something that I'm wrestling with right now. But in the meantime, it's still a great picture of Guernica, and I'm glad to have it in a place where people can still get at it and use it, and they can. So that's as much time as I have to talk to you. Thank you.
So, my name is Sean Wilbury. I work at the Met. Name of my group is, it's a new group within our digital media department. It's called Collections Information Services, and one of the things that we do is we handle our digital asset management. And so, before I get into some of the specifics about what we're doing at the Met, I wanted to start with a couple of slides which I recently came across. This is a company called KPCB. It's a consultancy outside of Silicon Valley. One of the principals there is Mary Meeker, who some of you may know from the first dot-com boom, was an analyst at Merrill Lynch. Every year she puts together this report, an annual report. It's the state of the internet. It's a huge document. It has all sorts of incredible information, what's going on in China, what's going on in mobile, et cetera, et cetera. As someone who's involved in digital asset management, these are the kind of things that I pay attention to when I see stuff like this, right? The world's content is increasingly findable, shared, tagged, and is up 9 times in the last 5 years. In terms of photos, 500 million uploaded and shared per day. I was wondering recently as to why Snapchat may have turned down a valuation for $3 billion in acquisition. If you look at that green bar right there, that's Snapchat's growth just this year, compared down to Facebook at the bottom. Video, 100 hours per minute from YouTube. I mean, you guys have probably seen this stuff before, but I think it's always interesting to sort of remind ourselves what is actually happening now when in an environment where digital content has never been easier to sort of create and share and disseminate. And what does that mean for us, people who are working in this industry, of trying to manage this content, make it understandable, make it knowable, make it shareable, and also coming to some sort of decisions about what can we do with the limited resources we have, given the preponderance of content that's being out there and being generated on a daily basis. And then the last thing, I was putting this slide together, right? I came across this, Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year, selfie, right? I mean, I think that says it all. And so, to my rimshot title, right? This is the fire hose, this is the stuff. And you're sort of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Because I'm going to stipulate right now that we are not going to be able to handle everything that's created, even within our own institutions, and we should just accept that. I think we're going to have to make determinations, given the resources we have, given the devices that people own and carry around with them every day, that there's only so much that we are going to be able to do. And so how do we make decisions about what's important and what's the sort of stuff that we can let slide? I'm going to sort of skip this in the interest of time, but in basically what you're looking at here is a sort of a diagram of our internal digital asset management infrastructure. The stuff on the right is the content coming in. The stuff on the left is the content going out. And I'm going to speak a little bit about both of those, sort of the inflow and the outflow. So the first is the output, right? What is the digital content that the museum has, and where does it appear? And increasingly, almost exclusively now, it's appearing online. And if you were to graph the Met's digital presence over time in the same way that you saw those graphs of YouTube's digital presence or images, photos being shared over time, you would see from 2007 it was like this, and now it's just increasingly ramping up, ramping up, ramping up. The very first question we get when we're talking with anybody in the museum about their digital projects, the first question they ask us is, how can we get it online, right? So this is some of the stuff that we work with. We work with ArtStore, obviously, on the images for academic publishing. We do our image licensing with another third party called Art Resource for commercials. This is a screenshot of the request form that we have on our website. The Met was one of the original participants in the Google Art Project, now the Google Cultural Institute. At that time, it was 17 institutions. Now I think Peter said it's over 350. Probably less well known, we participated in Google Goggles, where we gave Google 76,000 images of works that were two-dimensional in the public domain, which was an interesting sort of taxonomical or data problem. Because we use TMS for our collections management system, as far as I know, at least we don't record what a 2D work is in TMS, so we had to rely on things like classifications and object rights in order to determine what were the set of data that we were going to be able to send to Google for this project. If anyone doesn't know what Goggles is, it's image recognition. So you take your smartphone, you take a snapshot of whatever. Doesn't have to be in the gallery. It could be a picture on a bus. It could be in a book. And it will identify what that thing is and take you to our website. We just relaunched our mobile guides. These are the audio guides that you get inside the building. We went through a project that took about 3 to 6 months where we received a 10-year back catalog of audio material from our former vendor. The Met has now owns this project, but up until recently we had outsourced it. So we have to manage the audio materials as well as the information that gets deployed out to our mobile guides. This is from our library. We have an art library, Watson Online. This is actually managed by OCLC, but our library is doing scanning of archival materials. This is excavations from the Karga Oasis in Egypt, I believe. It was mentioned in an earlier session. Last year, the Met put out close to 1,000 publications on our website. These are our own backlist from our editorial, out of print, art catalogs, things like that, bulletins. Our photo studio purchased a 3D camera recently. It's a turntable with a robotic arm. Some people, it's mostly used in the commercial space for doing things like shoes and whatnot, but we've been shooting it objects, a small amount, maybe about 50, 75. This is an example on a project for our Met pubs called 82nd and 5th. This is a three-dimensional view. Doesn't do it justice in a screenshot, but you can drag the cursor and rotate around. Generates an enormous amount of photography. Not enormous. I mean, traditionally, our photo studio would shoot 1, 2, 4, maybe shots. The lowest level that you can get on something like this and have a satisfactory spin is probably 36. Most of them are in the hundreds for a single object. And then we have our online collection. We have over 500,000 images just in our online collection. And we relaunched in 2011, and when we did relaunch, we pushed about all this content out at a very high quality. Where available, 4,000 pixels, so we can do things like this and get in close to our objects. This is a zoom. Again, doesn't do it justice here. So that's where our content is appearing, and that's just mostly within the properties. And when I say properties, I mean the websites, the online presences that we sort of own. And in order for us to be able to support that, we needed to make some decisions and we needed to make some adjustments into the way that we were managing our own content internally. Because like I said, what we found is these projects are going to happen regardless of whether or not the content is properly archived, right? There's going to be people who are going to be shooting three-dimensional works, they're going to be doing scannings from books, they're going to be generating all of this content and looking for ways to get it out there to as many people as possible. And so what we needed to do is we needed to find a way that we can adapt as an institution to help manage this content and make sure that, one, it's going to be properly managed long-term, but also can fold into the workflows of these various projects. And so in order for us to do that, we had to evolve. I think like a lot of institutions, certainly, I think Scott had touched on this a little bit, a lot of people start with digital asset management as a sort of tool for their photo studio, and it becomes a repository of images of works in the collection. That's certainly how it was for us, right? So a lot of the stuff when we first launched our DAM, which is now going back 5-6 years, the primary source of content in the DAM was images of objects in the collection, right? But now, like I said, we've had to evolve in order to support the myriad projects that are bubbling up and the myriad types of digital content that are being produced in the museum for these projects. So right now, we look at ourselves as being the warehouse, the repository for all the digital archival content. And when I say archival content, basically what I mean is, and this is not, you know, an academic definition, as I say, it's the best available, it's meaningful, and it's in service of our institution's mission. And by those things I mean, best available is no compression. We really don't care that much anymore about compression because storage is no longer a primary concern for us. It's still a concern, but it's not the primary concern. When I say meaningful, I mean accurate metadata. Not the name of the file necessarily, but describe to me what this thing is, because it does no good to take a file and park it on a server if no one knows what it is, right? And in the service of the museum's mission is sort of a way of saying we need to sort of justify, this gets back to the idea of the flow, the fire hose. We need to be able to justify, given our limited resources, that this content has long-term purpose and use beyond the personal, right? It's not your snaps from your trip to Malta, you know, over Christmas. It's something that we can justify as being in the service of the museum's mission. Again, some typical file formats that we use for the content we're managing. Again, I think this is fairly straightforward. TIFFs for images, WAVs for audio, PDFs for documents. And so here's some examples of stuff that we're doing with content outside of traditional images of art objects. This is a audio file. Like I said, we have on our current, we have over close to 5,000 audio stops from the lifespan, the entire lifespan of our audio guides. We now have all of this content as WAV files in our digital asset management system with the metadata around it. This metadata is completely different from the kind of metadata that we would record around images of art objects, right? We have things like the language, we have the actual transcript, we have the contributors. In this case, it's from the director's tour, the narrator, the producer, et cetera, et cetera. We also have the signed releases that went along with the creation of this audio tour. Again, one of the projects that we had to work on is we have to determine, do we have the rights to this content and what rights do we have? Can we put it on the website, for example, even though this content was originally made for a device that probably does no longer exist? These are PDFs of our exhibition catalogs. These were all digitized in order to go onto the web. Again, in order to support this stuff, we have to make sure that we're managing it properly. We have similarly a different type of metadata schema to describe this book. We have the classifications, we have who the contributors were, et cetera, et cetera. Our Watson library is actively engaged in book digitization. These are examples of the pages from various manuscripts that they've been digitizing. They've probably at this point done over 10,000 volumes. I'm not sure the exact number. And all of their content is being available on Content DM by OCLC. And we've been making sure that we have the archival version of this content so that if we decide to push it out to some other platform in the future, we can rapidly push that out. Conservation photography. Our conservation department is separate from our photo studio. They generate their own imagery. They generate a lot of imagery. A lot more imagery than our photo studio does, from before treatment, after treatment, during treatment. Some examples from a project that we worked on for Rembrandt paintings. Event photography. Again, The metadata on this is a little bit more free-form, but we want to be able to know what is this thing, right? If we don't know from, in this case, we just use basic keywords. If we just don't know, it's people sitting in an auditorium. Well, what event is it? Who shot it, right? And we may want this for future use, so we want to make sure that we have it. Gallery photography, staff photography, right? The point is that this is complicated. There's a lot of stuff here. We have over now 2 million unique digital assets and 100 terabytes of dedicated storage. That's grown probably 75% over the last couple of years. In terms of usage, we have 400 people who access our DAM, unique logins to our DAM every month. It's only available to internal staff, but that's still 400 internal staff, volunteers, interns, fellows, et cetera. And typically, we'll see around 7,000 downloads a month. It's the second most used application in the museum. The first is our collections management system. The second is our digital asset management system. This is our stack. Again, this is, I mean, it's complicated. It's an enterprise, we use MediaBin, it's an enterprise level app. It requires enterprise level infrastructure. We have web servers, clustered web servers, clustered application servers for load balancing, and a dedicated database. It's a big program. 100 terabytes is a fair amount of allocation. This complexity can be managed, right? So how do we manage this? We get requests all the time from curators like this, and they say, you know, we have this stuff on this disk, and can you do something with it? And we say, sure. And one of the things that we do to sort of help us in terms of managing complexities is we don't want to sweat with the small stuff, right? When I first started with this group, a lot of the things that we were spending our time doing was just basic training explanation to staff as to how to use the system. And so what we've done is we've come up with, this is the login screen for MediaBin, we've come up with a very simple set of user guides, documents, walkthroughs as to, you know, how to do the things that you need to do. At the bottom right there, we actually created a series of training videos. We got some screencasting software, plugged in a microphone, and started with this is how you log in. Right? It saves us from answering sort of like these basic help desk questions, like how do I log in, how do I find what I'm looking for, how do I do this? And it lets us focus on some of these larger projects that are a little bit more complicated. So that when we do get these requests, the first thing that we actually do is we make people fill out we fill out a form. We give them a guide. We say, look, these are our recommendations, and you need to tell us a little bit about the content that you would like us to help you manage. Part of the reason why we do this is to manage the flow, but another reason why we do this is because we found that it helps build that sort of collaboration and participation and ownership in that process, right? As opposed to, you know, you are the tech guys, here's my files, you figure it out. It's like, well, we may be the tech guys and we may be able to understand your files, but you know what this stuff is, right? You took it or it was given to you, and we need your participation in this in order for it to work. We've set up metadata templates. We've started with basic things like Excel in order to let people describe what it is that they're contributing to us. But increasingly, we've been looking at using embedded metadata tools. So when we were looking around at embedded metadata, if you've looked at embedded metadata as it relates to art objects, they're all over the place. You can download images from a dozen different museums and get a dozen different formats as to what's in the description field, what's in the keyword field, what's in the title field, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to sort of systematize it a little bit, we defined our own namespace. When we divide it into three parts. We have object for stuff related to object, which is our basic tombstone information. We have rights for image rights, IP. And then what we call studio, which is more production-related information. And I'll show you some examples of this. I don't know how easy this is to see, but all of this is actually coming out of our DAM, right? So we defined it in our DAM. So when you download something from our digital asset management system, if this information is there, it will get embedded directly in the file following this namespace. And this ensures that as this file travels around, whether it's to the website, whether it's to any of these other sort of outgoing projects that I was talking about, this information, if it exists in the DAM, will be contained directly within the file. One of the things that we also, that's for output, one of the things that we also did is we want to be able to use this for input as well. We don't want to have to rely on things like spreadsheets and parsing out that information. So we set up a panel. This is an example of what it looks like in Photoshop. It's the same thing. Top, the object information, the middle, the rights, and then studio information, what we call photographer or image view description, et cetera, et cetera. This allows the people who are contributing the assets to us to directly embed that information in the files, and that way when we ingest them into the system, all of this metadata will be carried over automatically, right? We don't need to worry about what this thing is. We'll let you define what that is with the fields that we're providing you and bringing it into our DAM. We've also been working on, this is sort of the same set of fields but in a different format. This is XML. We have an XML task that will separate the metadata from the asset and just spit it out individually or separate from the asset. We've been experimenting with ArtStore to use this as a method for identifying our objects where we can transition or transfer images and sidecar XML in order to identify what this thing is. And then finally, this is more sort of work in progress, but we do know that people are not going to look at a specific namespace. I mean, the people who are very much interested in looking in that namespace, embedded metadata, will find it, but your casual user probably won't. So we've been looking at ways, and this is an example of which we're using a tool called Exif Tool, which I'll talk about in a second, to take that embedded metadata that's already present in the file and repackage it into the more front card metadata fields that you see, in this case, document title, DC description. I don't know how much time people have spent with looking at XMP or IPTC. The metadata fields are kind of a mess. It's evolved over time to suit a variety of different purposes and workflows. This is not sort of an ideal scenario to my mind. But it is a sort of realistic and pragmatic one, right? This is the software. If anyone's going to be looking at for information in the file, this is probably the place where they're going to start. And not just in Photoshop, right? It also handles differently in a variety of other image viewers. In terms of tracking, again, this is for our internal tracking. We use a tool called Jira. It's by a company called Atlassian. It's mostly for help desk. But it's a great tool for tracking projects. You can do assignments, you can set priorities, you can have tasks within tasks, or what they call subtasks, and then you get lots of nice data visualization like this. I mean, again, in terms of managing the flow, there is so much stuff, it's gone far beyond, for us anyway, having sort of like Microsoft Project or Excel lists saying, this is what we're working on. We needed a more sort of robust way of being able to handle all of this stuff. How am I doing? In terms of analytics, we've set up reports to report on all of the activity that's going on within our digital asset management system. Like, none of this stuff came to us out of the box. This is all stuff that we had to evolve over time as we were working through these processes. This is an example of logging that we've done to see exactly how people are searching within our DAM. And this allows us to make adjustments to sort of to preface or to elevate certain metadata fields over others for search. And then finally, just some quick tools that we've used that I find helpful outside of like your standard digital asset management system. And basically, we've got three. ImageMagick. If you are involved in images, you should be using ImageMagick. It's a shameless plug. It's free. It's open source. It is incredibly powerful. Whether the Google Goggles example I was talking about, we had to deliver to them 76,000 images at a very specific dimensions, pixel width. We could have used our DAM to do that, but it would have required downloading 76,000 images. Since we already had the images on our website, we used ImageMagick to script it up and spit it out. Exif Tool. This is very janky, but it's incredibly powerful too. It allows you to essentially read and write metadata directly into any sort of file. It's mostly used for images, but you can use it for PDFs. Anything that embeds metadata in it, you can use this tool essentially to read and write from. And then the last is Windows Live Photo Gallery. I sort of hesitated to put this on there because this is not open source. It's Microsoft. It's free. If you have Windows, you can download it and install it for free. We use this now, we recommend using this at the museum for people who need to do basic imaging work. People will call us up and they say, I need Photoshop. And we say, why do you need Photoshop? And they say, I have to resize the file. And I was like, you don't need Photoshop for that. You can use something else. So we like it for that because it's basic imaging function. But we also like it because when I was talking about embedded metadata, it has very clear and easy ways for people to contribute information directly into the file in bulk and then share that content with us. That's it. Thank you.
Problem solved, right? Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks to Scott, Evan, and Sham. That was really, really remarkable. My other kind of quick question is, what's Snapchat? Has anyone heard? I've never even heard of this today. I'm so behind the times. Anyway, but really, let's open this up to everyone. So please, anyone who has any questions, we have plenty of time for some questions. Yeah.
I was wondering if anyone had any specific advice for first-timers, like you're in the process, this is our first dam, just some ground-level basic, don't do this or make sure you do this kind of advice.
Do you already have a dam? You're in the process of looking for one?
We have a dam.
Well, it's too late then. I mean, I would say that if you're in the process of looking at one, you should not assume that you're going to find anything that's going to do everything that you need it to do, right? There is no product out there unless you're going to build it yourself it's going to meet all your use cases. So that I think the best that you could hope for is something that's going to approximate, right, what you want to do with it. If you can hit 80% of what you need to do, that's probably good enough. Because, yeah, the systems that are out there, by and large, have not been developed for museums or to accommodate museums' workflows. They've been developed around things like the print industry, the publishing industry, the media industry, which are completely different animals.
Why don't you talk about use cases for a minute, though? Because I think that's a really important first step, is to develop some use cases so that you actually...
Sure, yeah. I mean, if you're in the process of going out there and looking at the marketplace, I mean, the very first thing you need to have, I think, is a definition of what your use cases are. Those are, I mean, what the use cases are for the Met and what they're going to be for your institution are completely different, I'm sure. Like I said, when we started, it was very much looked at as something that was going to be under the auspices of our photo studio and has evolved over time to incorporate a tremendous range of different digital content. It wasn't what we envisioned necessarily at the time. Every institution is going to be different in terms of what they want to do with it, what they're looking to achieve.
Are you familiar with use cases?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, yes.
I'll spend the days and for architecture. We're also going through a similar process at the moment. I manage all our digital aspects, not just images. In fact, I would say what we're working on tomorrow morning. But one of the issues that comes up when we start talking about events and installation use is the selection process. Our photographers take tons and tons of photos of every event and every installation of our exhibitions, but then how do you go about deciding what you're planning your dam? Because that's one of the challenges we're entering at the moment.
Do you want to take this?
You can do it if you want. I mean,
So I would say that we do one of two things, depending on what the use case is. We will either take everything, because like I said, the storage is no longer an issue for us, or we will rely on the person who is contributing the content to make that selection for us, right? And this is what I was talking about in terms of working with the partners, the content contributors. Like my group does not do we don't do any scanning, we don't have any cameras, we don't have any photos set up. We just act as a pass-through for a lot of this material. So if it's important to you, as the person who's creating this content for your particular purposes, then we need you to be a part of that discussion in determining, how important it is. If you can't be bothered to do that and you just say, well, here's all 150 of them, then we'll take all 150 of them. Because especially when we're talking about things like images, like I said, the storage is really not that much of a concern for us.
yeah, let me just add to that. Because we aren't running a DAMS properly yet, we're still, and our relationship with Shared Shelf is still a pilot, That's definitely something that occurred to me as we were just even adding the small batch that I showed you is, does a click of the photographer's shutter equal a enduring archival object? And personally, I'm not entirely sure it does. And perhaps an appraisal process needs to be added to the workflow of ingest so that we can reduce the sheer amount of stuff. And we can say, this is enough to document an event, or, and we probably envision a little bit more intervention in our organization than they have at the Met.
And
Mhm.
actually being able
Right.
to assess inside who that client is,
Mhm.
because especially for event and
Right.
exhibition photography, exhibition photography, like particularly event photography,
Right.
you have an opening, you take photos, who's client of that photography, who's going to make the determination on what's important.
Right. And,
That's
yeah.
critical.
So, right. And another thing to imagine in this case that's been problematic is at what point in the photography workflow process is this a deliverable archival image? At what point are you done enough with it that we can add it to something, call it finished, and then share it within the organization? And that's another question that we just have yet to answer, but we feel your pain if that makes you feel any better.
Yes, Green?
Have any of you published studies that include timings for how long it takes people to enter metadata? That's talking about the batch, the batches. And then also, who's on the hook for remediating, when you find bad metadata?
I will tell you, no, I wish I'd put a stopwatch on it. I mean, when I do it, it's a little faster than when my assistant does it. So it really depends on who it is physically entering the data and how good, how fast you type and all of that sort of stuff. When we had been putting them into our library catalog that I showed you earlier, that was tedious because it's a full MARC record and it's original cataloging. And just making that record takes about 10 minutes. At that point, you add the images to it. Shared shelf is a lot faster because everything's based on the image, and you load in all of the images, and then you get to catalog 60 things all at once, which is both fun and really satisfying if you've ever been a cataloger of anything, to be able to do 60 things in one swoop because it's all the same photographer, the same date, all of that sort of stuff, or the same event. So I know the relativity of faster and slower. I mean, scanning a slide, we budget about 10 minutes for, and there's lots of different variables in there. But what I've found it kind of comes down to is that people get faster and faster and faster as they get more familiar with whatever environment we've thrown them into. So I couldn't tell you exactly, but maybe Sean does.
I would say that in general, we do not do that much metadata cataloging at all. We rely on the people who are contributing the content to us to identify what that material is. And like I said, it generally is either embedded directly within the file or with some sort of sidecar, either XML or Excel, that we can then parse out and directly map into our digital asset management system. So it's a very minimal amount of human intervention from my team's perspective. In terms of remediation, since these people, when mistakes do occur and are noticed, right, we will generally go back to the people who provided us the information and said, we've noticed that this is wrong, would you like to correct it? We generally do not correct other people's mistakes directly ourselves because we don't necessarily see ourselves slightly different from, I think, your role and yours. We don't see ourselves as sort of like the librarian and the people who need to sort of correct and perfect this information. Like I said, we're merely acting as a clearinghouse through which this information passes and making it as easy as possible for the information to come in and go out.
Who defines the minimal record for each area type of media?
Yeah, I mean, that was based on our recommendations, that, depending on what the type of material is that you're shooting, whether, or not even shooting, generating, it could be a book, like an exhibition catalog, it could be event photography, it could be object photography, gallery photography. We do have different metadata sort of templates or recommendations that we provide to the people who are generating this content. They are recommendations. We do have a core set of fields which we consider to be essential, right? You have to tell us what the file is at some level. But then we have some other ones which would be nice to have, but we would also, realistically understand if you're not going to provide a full corpus of information around the file. They're mostly recommendations with some small requirements. So we want to make it easy for people to contribute their content to us, but we don't want to make it burdensome so they're not going to do some, some minimal amount of work.
And so what we might look at if we're to adopt shared shelf is splitting up the task and giving the provider, the photo studio, editorial and graphic design, whoever it is, the task of giving us that basic metadata, and then it might move then to us to make it play nicely with all of the other data. Because there's nothing saying that the keywords they're using are consistent with the exhibition name that everybody else is using or the departmental name or anything like that. We're the ones who then have to massage the data and make it consistent. So, yeah.
Yes, the gray sweater.
Sure. Yeah. We do not have an institutional mandate to say that if you are doing this work, you must come to us in order to do it, right? So one of the ways that we've had to sort of sell this across the institution is to go out and to demonstrate success with the various people that we've worked with. And one of the ways that we can demonstrate success and help sell it is to talk about things like our retention policy. We have, and without going into all the specifics of our backups and everything, we can guarantee that your content in our digital asset management system will be much more secure than it is sitting on your computer, sitting in Dropbox, sitting on a CD in your drawer, et cetera, right? Our retention policy with regards to the underlying digital asset is we keep it forever. We have every revision to that original asset is kept forever as well. So if someone shoots something and then 6 months later does some post-production on it, we have both of those versions which are always saved off. In terms of our metadata, the metadata in our, we keep revisions of every change, but we only keep that history for 90 days. That doesn't mean that we purge the information after 90 days. I'm just saying we only keep a history for 90 days because frankly there's just way too much metadata in the system to try to keep a track of it longer than that. And most of the information that we do have in our digital asset management system now is sort of replicated from our collections management system, and therefore it's not essential for us to maintain that forever because we already have another system of record that has our object data.
We're working with our archivists to develop those policies. We have our regular records retention schedule, and so we're working on how to adapt that to serve electronic records needs. It's just still a work in progress at the PMA.
Yes. Yes, you.
Sean, what does Content DM do for you that the other systems don't do for you? Why do you know that also?
Content DM was a partnership between our library and OCLC, and it's essentially, like I said, like the very first thing that people want to do with any of this digital content internally is to make it available on the website, right? And Content DM was a very quick and dirty way to allow the library to put this archival material out on the web and make it accessible. There wasn't, when we were going through our website relaunch, there wasn't a natural place on our website for this content, and Content DM provides that place. I will say the other thing about what our library's been doing, not only have they been scanning a lot of this material, they've also been very active with Wikipedia in terms of annotating this material, in terms of the references. And I don't have the graph, you can Google it to find the interview. The traffic on the Content DM site has gone up like 500% since they've been participating with Wikipedia, just putting in references to various books, works, et cetera, et cetera.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
Is that, are you going to have a migration path to have media bin handle that since it has all the capabilities and is more robust like Content?
So we don't use MediaBin as it's not a front-facing website. We have all the art. We have the original material that Watson is scanning within our DAM, and what gets pushed out to Content DM are JPEG derivatives from that archival scans.
So you're going to have 3 systems running
gets back into the earlier question about like use cases. I mean, in an ideal world, there would be a Swiss Army knife that would accomplish all these things, but I don't think that's the world that we live in. I think there's different systems which are good at doing different things, and what we've tried to identify, not just with stuff like this, but we were just talking about Archivist Toolkit, for example, earlier. There are various systems which are very useful at performing particular tasks, and we believe in systems of record, and that there are certain systems that should be used to accomplish certain goals. Our digital asset management system was never meant to function as a front-end portal. There are other DAMs that do. That's just not the one that we use. Our collections management system, if you use TMS, you know, it does the information around documenting the collection extremely well. Does other things less well, right? We believe in using the systems that we have for the particular purposes.
Yeah, and I'll just add that that's not a terribly unusual split to have the library collection managed in a different way than your art collection is managed. And Content DM does some things very, very well. It's good at multi-page documents in a way that nothing else is terribly great at. Our own digitized large texts go into archive.org because that's also a very good delivery system for large multi-page texts. We don't have a Content DM installation. It's not something that necessarily we won't consider. We just don't have it right now, and we recognize that exactly lots of different systems are, you know, we need a library system. That has to be unique. Our editorial and graphic design department needs a ticket management system. And so what we may end up looking at in the end is a constellation of interrelated systems that can play well nicely together. And every department gets to actually fulfill all their needs completely and doesn't have to compromise on achieving their goals just because we bought one DAMS or you know, employed one practice that, you know, works for most people most of the time.
Yes.
I'll do it for you. If you have $8 million, I'll do it. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't want to get into it in terms of this presentation because I wanted to talk more about like the non-object material that we're doing. But I mean, the very first thing that we did with our digital asset management system is set up an integration with TMS, right? It works, it's functional, but it is not ideal. And that recognizes the limitations of both TMS and both our digital asset management system. Oh, yeah. Oh, we should talk. Yeah. That's exactly right, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right, sure.
All right, we have time for one more question right there. Yes, you.
Content DM is a fine product. We don't have an implementation of it. I'm rather familiar with it from the archives world. There are things it does very well, and there are things, you know, that you have to work really hard to make it do well. It's good at multi-page documents. It's good at a letter that has two sides and keeping them in order as you look at them. There are other things, I mean, some people get an implementation of Omeka and sort of slap that on top of whatever they've got behind it, which might be Content DM, and use that to sort of add more of an impression to what you're looking at. Content DM, you know, it's fine for what it does, but it does a small set of things extremely well. And one of them is dealing with multi-page documents. It's good with archival things. It doesn't do archival hierarchy, or at least last time I looked at it, it didn't replicate, and nothing does. So that's an enduring problem. I mean, besides Europeana. Right. Right.
So in a way, you can also do it for collections. You can document the collection, and then under that collection, you can document the people.
Right, and if that's what's central to the mission of a given organization, then that's how they'll evaluate their products. I'm not sure we're looking at it that way right now, so we're not seriously looking at Content DM at the moment.
Well, please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers.